Good afternoon, good evening to many of you, good morning to some of you. I know we had 14 different people from 14 different countries that registered. I think many of you know the ILI, but those that don't know us as well, you can learn a little bit more at ili.org. But we primarily do training and technical assistance to governments, practitioners around the world. We run a host of courses. This year, all of them have been online. We've kind of transitioned our model nicely to a live online format. Hopefully next year, at least at some point, we'll be back in person. We've got a nice schedule of courses lined up for next year, including our natural gas development seminar, which will be May 3rd through 14th. Actually, it's kind of a 2 1-week options. The first week more on policy, the second week more on legal topics, or a combined 2-week course for both of them. You'll see a little bit of what we'll cover there here. A couple of procedural notes as we get started. Well, let me ask first, if it's possible to turn your camera on. I know Rob and all of us enjoy the energy of seeing smiling faces and nodding heads as we go along. So if it's possible to turn your camera on, please do. I know sometimes technical considerations mean you can't, and sometimes there's life going on in the background and you can't. So we understand if you can't, but if it's possible, please flip your cameras on. I'll also ask, turn your microphones off, at least for the initial part. If you have questions as we go, please use the chat and submit them to me, and I'll pass them on to Rob, or we'll do a question and answer session where we can turn mics on at the end as well. With that, I guess many of you know Rob. I'll also point out Guli Sabahi has joined us. Rob and Guli are co-course advisors for the course. I think many of you know Rob's accolades, but it's always fun to share him again. He, as I said, is our course advisor. He's got a long career in this area, 30 years in the private sector. He's worked across over 60 countries on 6 continents. He was most recently at the World Bank as the Oil and Gas Program Coordinator, a great amount of insight and knowledge. I think a great force in the classroom, always brings a lot of energy. I like to help with that energy. That's why I was asking about the cameras earlier. But Rob, thanks for doing this. Thanks for being here. And the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. I certainly appreciate your interest and your willingness to spend some time with us here today. I do want to start by just reminding everybody that I am a trained negotiator. I am not a medical doctor, and while we may be talking about a lot of information about the pandemic and COVID, that's coming from someone who's doing a statistical analysis of what's going on and relating it to how this affects our energy world. And so please don't misinterpret anything I might say about the disease or about the pandemic to represent some sort of enlightened, trained medical view. So let's just get started. What I'd like to do today is try to explain, at least in my way of thinking, why COVID is so important and why it is worrisome to so many planners, and how it is both affecting global economy and how those economics effects have rolled down into demand for primary energy throughout the world. And so we'll try to make those linkages. And what I have is about 16 slides, I think, that we can use to kind of provide some context for an open discussion at the end of the presentation, and maybe some additional background to help our way of thinking going forward. The world so far has taken the approach that the pandemic has done some damage to lives, to economies, to any number of different ways of measuring progress on the earth. But almost all of these forecasts say at some point that stops, and then we just go right back up to another trajectory that represented what happens historically. And I think that that's it's kind of a dumb economic analysis, that it really isn't trying to predict anything. It starts from a base and goes up. And most economic models kind of do that. And so what I'd like you to think about as we go through this discussion today is that the right way of thinking about it. That what we have to do is find some sort of bottom that's been created by this pandemic, and then what would the slope be after we reach that bottom? And that slope is always, like I said, is always forecast to be on an upward dimension. And that just may not actually be what happens. And we need to be thinking about, well, what happens in a world where that sort of economic model and those sort of projections and that sort of planning doesn't make sense anymore. So let's just kind of get into some of this and see. So I wanted to start with just kind of a comparison of COVID-19 or the novel coronavirus versus what we are accustomed to, which is the common cold and the flu. And again, just as a way of maybe clarifying what COVID-19 really is, I think it's important to have this kind of understanding. So I'll start with common colds. They're the things that are episodic. They're not seasonal. They're comprised primarily of rhinoviruses. Over half of colds are caused by rhinoviruses, but coronaviruses make up a significant portion of colds as well. There is no vaccine for the common cold, and that's because there are literally over 200 different kind of viral strains that cause cold-like symptoms. And so there's just no way to create a vaccine that has that sort of depth and breadth. So you just can't really come up with a very effective shot that would stop you from getting a cold from all these different possibilities. On the other hand, colds are they're just not that worrisome. The symptoms for colds are very short-lived. Usually you have it for a couple of days, your nose runs, and you can treat them with common cold medicines so that your symptoms aren't that bad. The annual experience could be as much as 2 to 3 episodes per person every year. And nobody really dies from a cold, but in the right situation and untreated, you might have some deaths that are that come by complications from colds. The seasonal flu is a little bit different story. It has generally 3 or 4 different variations of a virus that is causing the flu. And although it is more serious, it is not considered a deadly occurrence, and it's treatable with cold medications and other antiviral medications like Tamiflu. The experience here is a little bit different than the common cold, though. We have about 1 billion cases globally every year and 300,000 to 600,000 deaths. So it's again, it's a serious health issue throughout the world. I do want to say here that there are flu shots, there are flu vaccines. Those tend to be guesses on what the actual flu virus will look like every year. Sometimes medicine guesses right, and sometimes they don't guess very right. And so the actual effectiveness of a flu shot is somewhere between 35 to 60% effective, which means that if you get a flu shot, you have a 65 to 30% chance of getting it anyway. So there's kind of a common misconception that if you get a flu shot, you won't get the flu. It's obviously still a good idea because it reduces your chances of getting the flu. It also oftentimes reduces the symptoms if you actually do get the flu. But the vaccine itself does not and has never eradicated the flu itself. And that's important to remember as we start to talk about the COVID-19. So it's different, and it actually kind of combines both elements of the common cold and the flu, which is unfortunately a very, very bad thing. So there's no vaccine or cures yet. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that in a little bit. Some news just came out yesterday about a possible successful vaccine. It's very highly contagious, and the other really dreadful characteristic of this is that it's passable from patients who have no symptoms. So they don't even know that they're sick, but they're carrying the virus and they give it to somebody who does get very sick. It requires a much longer recovery, and there's a much higher mortality rate than influenza. And our current experience as of yesterday was somewhere between 50 to 200 million cases and 1.5 million to 3 million deaths. So you can see that that's far less than the annual experience for the flu, but far more deadly. And these numbers are not very accurate. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So it's also a little bit worrying because we know we're having a bad experience, but we may not know exactly how bad, especially as you go into places that traditionally don't have very good reporting systems, data gathering and reporting. So I want to start here to try to get, I don't know how many people we've got on the call now. Hopefully we have enough that we might find a little variation, but just as an example about how this particular virus would spread, I'd like to start with a hypothetical situation where you have a super spreader event. And my super spreader event turns out to be a football match. So if 10 people who have the disease but don't know they have the disease, but are at a stage in their encounter with the disease that they can spread it, if they went to a football game and just roamed around, had something to eat, cheered when their team scored a goal, and just did kind of normal human things, maybe took public transportation on their way home, and just kind of had a normal full day experience in an event where it was highly populated. The question is, if 10 such people went to an event, how many people could potentially have the virus after 21 days? So they would give it to somebody who would give it to somebody else. So in front of you, you should have I hope you have the poll, and I think what you need to do is just click on what you think the answer is and then hit submit. So let's just see what people think. I'm guessing, Gorgon, you're still waiting for answers?
Yes, there are still 4 people who didn't answer.
We're not going to give a discount to anybody if you get the answer or fine you for getting it right or wrong. Pick one and let's go.
We're doing math on exponential growth.
Okay, I'm closing the poll and I'll show you the results.
All right, so most people thought that it's very, very a big number. In truth, the number that I calculated was 185,000. So, and that was using some fairly conservative estimates about how the spread might occur among those who get it secondarily or tertiary. But yeah, after 21 days, you have at least 3 different baselines that you create, and then that baseline goes out and spreads it further. So again, it's a very worrisome thing for social planners and the medical profession, which kind of takes us to, well, where are we? Okay, so as of Sunday, these are the numbers that have been gathered by the World Health Organization, that over 50 million cases have now been recorded. I want to drill down into this a little bit. I don't know, for those of us who are living in the United States, seeing what happens day by day in the US, is pretty clear, but I don't know that those of us here think about the global aspect of this. And so what's really interesting, I guess, from a statistical standpoint, but also very troubling, is what's happening in the rest of the world. So you can see in May and June, really those numbers were created by the experience of people in the United States and to some degree in Europe, especially early on in Europe. Most of the cases were coming out of Europe. But as we go through late summer, you see that India and Pakistan and Bangladesh had a tremendous rise in cases, and Europe pretty much stabilized. But then you get to where we are today. Well, I then went through a period where South Asia declined again, but Europe started to take off. And so here we are today, and I want to just point out a couple of things. The growth in the cases is going up everywhere, and I don't think that we should be less concerned in places where the bars are very tiny. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, but it does appear that the bars are rising in just about every aspect of the globe. So this is Middle Eastern, this is South Asia and Asia again. You can see a tremendous growth in the cases in Europe over the last 3 or 4 weeks. Again, very troubling, and it almost overshadows what's happening in the US. Somebody needs to mute their microphone, please. And again, like I said, it's almost hard to see what's happening in the US, which is also equally troubling. So this is a very opportune time to be talking about the pandemic, because the forward trajectory is unknown, but it's extremely troubling. The other thing I want to point out, and the way we should be thinking about this, is there definitely are waves of the illness contagion, I should say. So we started, this doesn't start at the beginning, but we start way back here in February and have a very, very small base, and it grows to a significant level and forms a new base, and then it rises and forms a new base, and then it rises and forms a new base. And we're about at a point now where it's literally uncontrollable. So the base that we're creating here, we haven't done what we want to do as a world, which is bring these lines down in like different parts of the world like this. You know, that's the sort of thing we want to see. But globally, we have never been able to do that. So it's creating new bases, and it keeps going up and up and up, which again is extremely troubling. So what was the reaction? In March and April, there was literally a global lockdown based on the worst case scenarios that people were seeing early results that said there could be billions of non-immunizable illnesses, and that the death rates were exceeding up to 20 times what we observed in the influenza experience. So with that as a potential, it literally scared the hell out of all governments and politicians, I suppose. And so the only response that people believed was possible was what was observed in China, where they literally locked down everything. And so, you know, in other words, people could not leave their houses, people couldn't go to work, workplaces were closed, an utter complete lockdown, which could only be done in extremely autocratic societies. So most countries followed that example to some degree, and some were more autocratic than others, but almost to a country, some sort of lockdown occurred to try to contain the spread of the virus. as we came out of that first phase of lockdowns, unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of good information that planners and governors could use to try to decide what to do next. So there were really no standards around guidelines for testing or even test kits, as it turned out. So there were many, many different ways to test, all with different sorts of rates of exactness. There was no really standard way of reporting. In the United States, I'll give you a couple of examples. In the state of Florida, for instance, they did not report deaths of people who died inside of the state of Florida, but were not legally residents of Florida. So, you know, those deaths just kind of went missing in the statistics. In many places, especially in the early days, if someone died of COVID, but literally died, but they didn't have an autopsy and they didn't actually test for COVID. So if there was no way of proving that the virus was actually in this person who died, it wasn't reported as a COVID death, even though they probably died of COVID. So there's a lot of early underreporting, and that still is probably going on in a lot of different places. So the statistics were scary to begin with because of the explosive growth and the mortality rates associated with the disease. And over time, I think we've learned that many cases have gone underreported or unreported, which means that it's probably a lot worse today than what the World Health Organization is showing. So they're showing proved cases. It's actually much worse than that. So this is leaving policymakers with an impossible decision. Do we shut down and really reduce our gross domestic product in our economy and all the things that happen, you know, both economically and socially if we do something like that? Or do we try to maximize, you know, life-saving efforts? And it's an impossible decision that, again, governors have to make at this particular time. And they're going to have to make it again as we see what's happening in the next couple of days. So here's what I see as kind of a path that people are taking to try to respond to the pandemic from both a medical and social standpoint. So these are challenges, and it's very difficult to overcome these challenges because we just don't we don't have that sort of, well, there are many of these things are just beyond our control, but let me just kind of go through them. So the first is what we have as of right now are only 3 different defenses against the spread of the disease. One is to have people everywhere wear masks virtually all the time. And masks do 2 things. Most masks just prevent the person wearing the mask from contaminating other people in other places. So it's not actually protection from, it is a way to reduce the person who's wearing the mask from giving it to others. And you have to have very special masks for it to work the other way to actually protect yourself. So masks in themselves are a good way to limit the spread, but they do not actually offer much protection. The second is to distance. So if you are outside and you are more than generally 2 meters away, the odds of contracting the virus are much less than if you were indoors in very close proximity. And then the last is just to be clean. So you wash your hands, you wash surfaces. You can kill the virus by cleansing. So that's it. Those are the sort of defenses that we've had as human beings since the beginning of time, basically. So they're not very sophisticated. They are semi-effective, But if everybody, and I mean everybody, doesn't practice these behaviors, then it just doesn't work very well. And we can see that in the numbers. People, as soon as they feel like they're safe, they stop wearing masks. They start getting into super spreader events where there's a lot of aerosol spreading of viruses in very small distances. And again, they just, they're not as vigilant about cleaning their hands and their surfaces as they were to begin with. So it's very, very difficult to change human behavior in a very short time and try to get people to understand and practice the only defenses that we have right now. The next challenge is going to be to create a safe, effective, long-lasting, and inexpensive immunization system. And what we found out yesterday was that Pfizer and companies have created what they believe is a very effective immunization, but we don't know a lot about what has actually come out. So they claim it's 90% effective. That's over a fairly small sample. For instance, again, just to remind you, influenza in the best case is about 65% effective. So to claim 90% effectivity would be really exceptional. But what we do know is that the drug needs to be kept and shipped and stored at -80 degrees Celsius, which is almost cryogenic, which is far beyond the refrigeration capabilities of most health facilities in the world. So they have some very, very difficult logistic issues to try to face if they think that they can get this virus, or excuse me, this immunization made in a way that's not only safe and effective but long lasting. The other thing we don't know is the early communication is that you have to take 2 shots of this. And they'd be 2 weeks apart, and then you would be immune from the virus, but nobody knows for how long. So it's possible that again, the early testing just hasn't gathered enough information to know. So the early testing basically says if you get the immunization and you get the booster, you won't get the virus if you immediately come in contact with it. We don't really know if that will happen 3 weeks or a month later. So there's still a lot of information out there. Great positive news, but
Rob, we can't hear you. You
seem
went
to-
on mute.
There we go.
Okay.
okay, we're good. All right. So beyond just the creation of the immunization, trying to get enough of it produced so that it'll work throughout the world is going to be a real challenge. And it doesn't really help if you only have enough for a small community. You really need to think about this on a global scale, how you would distribute and administer those. And then even with that, again, it's not likely that the immunization will eradicate the disease. So you have to think about how would you reestablish health confidence in workplaces, schools, and social activities so that you can actually go back to an economic system or an economic infrastructure that somewhat resembles what we had before the virus came. And then after all of that, after you've restored all the confidence and you've eradicated the virus, you still have to provide a lot of economic resources to reestablish businesses that failed during these lockdown periods or semi-lockdown periods. So I want to quickly, these are a little bit complicated slides, but they're important because they are the basis of how you would be thinking about how the virus will impact the global economy. This first slide shows contagion on the left-hand scale. So to the degree a country has experienced a lot of contagion, their bubbles are going to be higher than the countries that are on the bottom, right? And then on the bottom scale is GDP diminishment, if you will. So it goes from 0 on the far right, where no GDP erosion has occurred, to 30% GDP decline on the left-hand side. And so you can see the arrow is kind of showing you there, as contagion goes up, GDP decline goes up. And that kind of makes sense, right? So what's happened is countries have shut down their social lifestyle, which in turn has shut down a lot of their economy, and they've done that more and more depending on how bad the pandemic has struck their country. So that's something that we would expect. This chart shows now we're comparing energy with economies, and there's a lot of data here, but basically we also know that as economies rise, the amount of energy needed to support that economy also rises. And so what's the converse of that is, if economies are declining, which is the direction that I'm showing the arrow to be, as economies decline, so does the need for energy. Okay, so we've got two things going on here. We've shown that the virus is decreasing economies, and since economies are decreasing, demand for energy has gone down as well. And so this is what the International Energy Agency has studied and shown, that the impact on energy now, on energy demand, is a function of the response countries are taking to eradicate or to limit, I guess, the contagion in their country. So if you have limited restrictions, what's been observed is somewhere around 5 to 10% energy demand decline. If you partially lock down, so you say there are some essential businesses that remain open, but many businesses are not, or we're going to have some sort of limitation on super spreader events and things like that, somewhere between 15 and 20% decline in primary energy demand. And if you go down to full lockdown, which is kind of what China did early on, you can experience reduction in energy demand of over 25%. That would be only for the periods in which you've taken these measures. So there's no case that we're aware of where, like for an entire year, a community or a country has seen these high rates of energy decline. But for moments, for periods, for 3 or 4 week periods, you see these sorts of things. So the degree of the response and the duration of the response will determine what the full year energy reduction is. What the IEA has suggested is, if you look at the blue bar on the right, total primary energy decline in 2020 is predicted to be about 6%. And then that varies depending on what sort of component is being used to supply primary energy. And it's interesting to kind of look at that. So if we go through each one, coal is showing about an 8% decline. That's very regional. So in places like the United States, where there has been a decline in primary energy demand, the country can decide, how that new lower demand will be met. And in the case again of like electric power in the United States, they're turning away from coal generated power and using other forms because that's just kind of what makes economic and logistic sense. If you look at renewables, for instance, they're actually showing an increase in demand for renewables. That is primarily occurring in Europe. Same thing. Europe has a choice to make, and they're choosing to continue to meet most of their electric power demand through renewable resources. And they're using less other things like coal and like gas to meet those needs. So it's not, I guess the lesson here is it's not going to be shared uniformly across the board, and it really depends on location and what your options are. The last point I'll make on this slide is the red bar, or oil. Now that's directly correlated to transportation. So people are driving less, they're flying less. We've come up with new ways of learning and meeting and acquiring foodstuffs and other things, so that personal transportation has gone way down throughout the world. And so the demand for oil in particular has really gone down. And again, it is different depending on what part of the world you're in and what country you're in. But we've seen declines in the United States in production as much as 15% probably for this year. So it may be 9 or 10% globally, but in certain regions, the demand for oil has gone way down. So what happens on the other side? How do we recover? And what I've done here is just shown different slices of the global stock market, if you will, in different industrial segments. And I'm using the performance of the stock or stocks. These are combined, again, stocks of, I'm using the performance of different segments of stocks as a proxy for kind of economic activity. And I think it's a good proxy. So what I've really shown there are 4 different industrial segments. The red is healthcare, the green is consumer products, the yellow is heavy industry, and the blue is transportation. And you can see that from top to bottom, healthcare did not decline as much as the other industrial segments. It recovered faster and is actually above the baseline as we speak. Consumer products, again, are consumables. They did a little worse, but still fairly well. Heavy industry really got shut down. As you can see in April there, they were the lowest performing stocks, showing that they had probably the highest amount of shutdown associated with them. And they are recovering, but not quite as good as the other segments. And transportation is the one that's really lagging behind and is likely to stay behind. So again, that transportation directly correlates to oil demand. So again, when we think about economic recovery, it's not just good enough to think about the global annual numbers, but to think about the recovery in terms of different segments of the economy and how energy intensive each of those are as they go through their recovery cycle. So we've come to another class poll, and I want to suggest that there are things that we are now doing as a world population that we never thought we would do, or certainly didn't practice even a year ago. So there's a lot more working from home. There's a lot more meetings that are occurring via computerized meeting applications like the one we're using today, Zooming versus getting on an airplane and flying to a meeting. There's a lot of urban vehicle sharing going on. People are not driving their own personal cars very much. There seems to be a whole lot of renewed interest in electric vehicles that we've seen in the United States and will probably spread out other places. And people for the first time have experienced a lot of ecological benefit. There are places throughout the world that were under so much air pollution that disappeared when lockdowns occurred, that people have now started to exert their influence to try to create a new economy that's much cleaner, that would result in a lot less fossil fuel use. And so the question that I'm just going to ask the group here is, what do you think? Have some of these behaviors changed permanently? And so your options are yes, no, or to some degree. So why don't we just take a quick poll and see what people are thinking? All right, let's see what the answers are. This should take a second. Well, this is interesting. So I'm guessing, can everybody see this?
Yes,
I'm guessing
they do.
everybody
Yes,
everybody
they
can
do.
see.
They do.
They do. Okay, good. Thanks.
Yes,
So-
yes, I can see.
Excellent. Thank you. So, you know, the interesting thing is 100% of the people on this call think that we're not going to revert to our old habits. And so it's going to be either some combination where we're going to see an entirely new way of thinking about primary energy demand, or at least some reduced demand. I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we go through the next couple of slides. So what I've drawn, this is primary energy demand over the last 20 years, I guess. At a 8% decline, which is what they're kind of forecasting this year, we're going to go backwards in terms of our demand, back to the maybe as low as what primary energy demand was in 2014. So that's what these arrows represent. That this much energy, and it's not just, this happens to be coal, the gray area, but I'm talking about in total, this much energy demand will be reduced this year. If you look at the last kind of contraction we had, that was in 2008 and 2009. That was when we had a financial crisis, and the observation here is that was a blip, right? That it went down, but it came right back up, and and it just continued to follow the trajectory that it was on. So we had 1.5 years. Her primary energy demand was not declined, but it didn't form a new low. It didn't form a new spot where we started to grow from that. It filled itself right back in, and 2 years or 3 years or 4 years from then, you didn't even remember that we had this sort of decline. So here's our options, and these are what economists are talking about, is what sort of economic recovery is likely to occur because of the pandemic. And the options that have been discussed are, well, V-shape, which is something like this, where you have a 1 or 1.5 year kind of decline because of the reactions or the actions that were taken to try to reduce the spread of the pandemic. But then as soon as that's all over with, you just go right back to where you were. And that would only occur if you could get a remedy very quickly. A U-shaped response would be, it's going to take some time. It's possible if you get a vaccine that's effective, you slowly kind of get control of the spread of the pandemic. And so over a period of 2 or 3 years, you have to suffer through a recession or some sort of economic hardship. But then again, you're right back on the same trajectory that you were on before. A W shape is one where either you think you've got the answer and then the hardship reoccurs, or we suffer one hardship after another after another. In other words, the virus mutates, and so in 1 year you do a good job controlling it and protecting people, but in the next year it doesn't work very well. Kind of the flu scenario, where in some years the vaccine is 65% effective, but in some years it's only 30% effective. And so you have to take fairly draconian methods to try to respond to that. So you get kind of a W-shaped recovery. And then the last option is an L-shaped recovery, where something happens that dramatically changes fundamentally how primary energy demand is created in the world, and then you start from a new point, and then kind of go from there. One such event would be either the introduction of a new form of energy, or it could be that the pandemic results in just massive death and destruction, and so you just have less people consuming energy, something like that. So those are the options, and I'm going to again ask the class to think about this and decide, where do you think we're headed? How we doing?
2 more people. Okay, so I unshared on the screen.
So again, this class has been much more reflective than what global economists have predicted. As you can see here, nobody is predicting a V-shaped response, yet that's exactly what most energy economists are predicting. So what the IEA and the US EIA are both showing forecasts that show some sort of significant but small decline this year, immediately starting to raise again in 2021. And it's pretty much the nature of economic modeling, that you start from a base and you increase it. So, oil prices start at some low point, and then over the next 20 years, they escalate. And if in the following year oil prices go down, you just start at a lower oil price, and then you take it up from there. So almost all these economic models are always predicting an upward slope, and not giving very much consideration to different possibilities. And it appears to me that we are going to suffer for the first time in a long, long time, a reduction in primary energy demand that will set a new base point, and the slope of which it rises is debatable, and so that needs to go into our thinking as we start planning for the future of our countries. And so that's kind of the message that we've gone through 14 slides here, but that's kind of the message that I wanted to initially leave you with, is there's so much uncertainty and there's so much potential harm that can be created by the pandemic. And we need to start thinking more smartly about not only each individual country's economy and how it may be affected and how it may respond, but what are the energy implications behind that sort of scenario. So what's happened so far? It looks to us like there's going to be at least 18 months now of lower hydrocarbon prices. You can see this is just a picture of crude oil prices, and what started out to be around $70 is now in the $40 range, so almost a 50% drop in the price of oil. That is very, very significant. And again, there doesn't appear to be either a supply or demand upset forecast to occur, or even a return of demand to occur in the next 12 months that would dramatically change what we're seeing today, where is a fairly stabilization of prices that are hovering right around $40. Further complicating that is that every nook and cranny of crude oil storage has been used. 200 million barrels of storage is now floating on super tankers that are just roaming around the world on oceans, just holding oil that has no home. So there's virtually no place that you can produce oil and put it anymore. So I think we're going to start to see more and more oil production decline occurring over the next 12 to 18 months. We've seen many energy company failures, cutbacks, project delays, and cancellation. In the United States, it's been estimated that about 15% of the energy workforce has been furloughed. And again, that's a very, very major amount of jobs that have been lost, excuse me, due to the decline in energy demand. As a result, a lot of climate change strategies have been stalled. Alternative energy development projects have been delayed. You know, there are benefits to some of this. Resource poor countries, in other words, countries that have to import hydrocarbons or fossil fuels, are enjoying lower prices. So to a certain extent, they're winners. Resource rich countries, those that are exporting hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, they're accepting much less prices for their commodities, and they're also not selling as much quantity as they had or were planning. So they're economic losers in this. It's hard to say, though, when a global economy is suffering, that there are actually any winners. So it's not a good situation that we would like to see extend for a long period of time, for energy prices to be so low that countries themselves are going bankrupt and industries are going bankrupt and are shutting down. That's, in the end, that's just not good for everybody. Okay, I got a couple more slides, and then I'd like to open it up for some questions and discussions. I'm not going to read this, but basically, the International Energy Agency has said that natural gas is going to experience the largest decline in demand in recent history. That started with a very warm winter last year, so demand was down right from the get-go in 2020. But then the pandemic caused shutdown, which lowered industrial demand. And there's one other thing I just want to mention at this part, because it has to do with natural gas in particular. China is a very big user of natural gas, and they made a policy decision to reduce the use of natural gas because they were importing it as LNG or by pipeline from Eastern Europe. And they chose instead to keep their coal mines and their coal-fired power plants open, because that affected, or that maintained their local economy. In other words, their industry didn't shut down, and they did not lose jobs as a result of a reduction in energy demand. What they did was just lower their imports and kept their internal energy machine going as it was. And so that decision I have a timer here that shows around the time. Can't seem to get it to shut up. All right. So anyway, that decision impacted natural gas more than you might expect, because again, the harm of that wasn't shared equally. So I think this is the last slide. So what can we do in this environment regarding policy decisions around natural gas? Well, the good things about gas is it's extremely affordable right now. It's very flexible in terms of it can be used both as a fuel and a feedstock in a way to kind of jumpstart local economies. It's operationally preferred because it's clean and predictable, and it's environmentally preferred because it has less pollutants once you burn it. The concern is that actually the use of natural gas relies on a natural gas value chain. And that chain is expensive and time consuming to build. So if you don't have pipelines and you don't have policies and you don't have regulation that allows for the increased use of natural gas, it's hard to take advantage of the fact that today gas is very affordable and very available. So my last slide and my suggestion to everybody is this is a perfect time to review your energy and natural gas strategies and master plans. So it's an opportunity to change if the country tends to want to price control everything. So you have a group inside a government that sets the price of things, and that tends to be a very arbitrary decision. This is a great time to switch to a market-based approach where you say we will price whatever commodity it is based on what the global market is, because the global market right now is at a very low point. And so anything that might be price subsidized currently, you wouldn't see much of an impact if you went to a market-based approach. And then going forward, people pay what the fair market price is of things. It's an opportunity to review, again, subsidy programs, including power supply. There's an awful lot of arbitrary pricing decisions that have been built into how power is produced in countries. And a lot of times the price of the energy that goes into generating power is priced below market. This would be a great opportunity to think about that and switch it maybe to a way that actually reflects what the true cost of power supply is. Lastly, people who know me know that I really have an aversion to scavenged biomass. I think that that's just a very bad practice. It's not healthy, it's not safe, and it's not economically efficient. And so there's an opportunity now to use natural gas or natural gas products like LPGs to substitute in for what is currently scavenged biomass, and it wouldn't cost the country very much money to do that at today's prices. So this would be an excellent time to be thinking about things like that. For countries that are consumers, this is a good time to audit your market-based energy contracts to make sure that the benefits of lower prices are actually being passed on to you. And it's also a great opportunity to convert short-term to long-term contracts, because the long-term contracts would reflect today's today's lower costs. And so you'd be able to capture the current low cost of energy for a longer period of time. For those countries that tend to be producers, there are a lot of service companies that are also suffering, and they're offering lower cost products and services. I would be thinking about doing that, renegotiating some of the contracts you might have for service providers, and even stockpiling some products that you might be able to use in the future. Again, if possible, this is the time you want to economically diversify your economy, because again, energy over the next several years is going to be hard pressed to return the sort of revenues that you might have built into your budget. And it's even an idea to think about banking reserves rather than producing more oil and gas to try to capture the dollars that you think you need, the revenues that you need. It may be actually a time to do the reverse, to bank some of these, to produce less, and keep those reserves handy for future years when economies recover, energy demand revives, and those reserves that you aren't producing now will be worth a lot more in the future. So with that, I'm going to stop. Again, if I had just a couple of things to say, the pandemic is a very serious issue. It has the capacity to do a great amount of social harm. What we've seen in the last several weeks is very worrying. The fact that we don't have good records and reporting and good processes on how to deal with this only exacerbates the problem. While we have some encouraging news about immunizations, there's a lot of logistical issues that have to be answered and a lot of effectiveness issues that need to be learned before we can say we've got this pandemic licked. That is going to cause governments and governors to reinstitute lockdowns, which are likely to again reharm local economies. And as a result, energy demand will continue to be lowered. I believe that it's not going to rebound to a previous case, that we're going to see some continuance of behaviors that permanently change energy. Natural gas has a lot of good benefits. If there's a way in this period to start planning on how you might be able to acquire and use natural gas or produce and use natural gas, it makes a lot of sense to me to build this into your future energy planning and your future supply for primary energy. And I think I've said enough for a minute anyway.
Well, we did have one question come in during the presentation, so perhaps we can start there, and then we'll ask from there. If people want to unmute and ask questions after, please do. This is a great time for that. But the first question that came in is, how does renewable energy such as solar and wind power play in the current scenario of declining demand for energy?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, the answer is different depending on what part of the world we're talking about. In Europe, it has clearly won over traditional fossil fuel forms of power production. And there's two reasons for that. One is that the incremental cost of producing power from renewables is very, very low. You don't have to buy fuel to generate power. You're using the sun's energy or the wind's energy to manufacture the electricity. So at an incremental basis, the cost of a kilowatt hour is much, much less than generating that same kilowatt hour by burning natural gas or coal. But to take advantage of that, you need to have grid systems that are capable of dealing with the interruptible nature of renewables. The wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, and so yeah, you may get some cheap power for a tenth of a second, but unless you have a steady, somewhat steady production of power, it doesn't actually meet the needs of society. So you have to have fairly sophisticated grid systems and different forms of backup to handle the interruptive nature of renewables. And they've done that in Europe. So you're seeing, as demand goes down, the first alternative source that you cut back is coal. Then the next available source is natural gas. And so you're seeing, again, a rise of renewables. So it's enjoying it's enjoying, it's been pretty much, I guess, immune from the decline in primary energy overall because the incremental cost of producing renewables is so low. That said, again, in certain places where it's very, very difficult to operationally handle renewables, it's not preferred, and so you'll see, you know, the use of renewables decline as well. My concern, I guess, is not so much the installed capacity of renewables, but what's going to happen to the plans to build more and more renewables as fossil fuels, the cost of fossil fuels decline, and the fact that we've already got a lot of installed power generation capacity that's not being used. It's likely that some of these new renewable generation projects will get delayed until countries and the world just needs more electric power, and then you'll start to see these projects come back.
We had a hand up by Nana Charles. Did you have a question? Okay. Well, there was another question that came in from the chat, Rob, and we'll let you take a stab at it. Maybe Guli has an answer here as well, because it's more of a legal question. But the question is, since the pandemic began, have there been a rise in investment disputes and commercial disputes in the LNG sector? What type of disputes are being seen?
Yeah, again, Guli may have some thoughts as well. In the very early stages of the pandemic, I'm aware that China and maybe other countries, but China for sure, claimed that a force majeure situation had occurred as a result of the pandemic, that the response to the coronavirus caused a decline in demand for energy in China, and they were using that as a declaration of force majeure to get out of their contracted obligations to purchase LNG for the first and second quarter of 2020. That claim was rejected by the producers of LNG. The facts behind the case were that China buys LNG on a long-term contract basis that's tied to crude oil, and they also buy LNG on the spot basis, which is tied to just local market conditions. The spot price of LNG went down to roughly $2 a million BTU, while the contract price was probably somewhere around $8 to $10. And so what was happening in reality was that China was not buying the $10 LNG, but buying the $2 LNG. And so the claim of force majeure, didn't seem to be borne out by the actual facts. We don't have any public information about how the dispute was resolved. My understanding is that the claim of force majeure was used as leverage to renegotiate some of the contracts and some of the cargoes, and that the producers and the buyers reached some sort of settlement where the cargoes were taken, but they were probably taken at some sort of discounted price. Those are the only occurrences that I'm aware of that have occurred in terms of commercial activities. Julie, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you gave a very good example, I think, of the reality here, because really how the parties will come out, on the force majeure claims really depends here on the parties involved, on the nature of the project, the status of the project, and really what the contract says on force majeure clauses, whether it includes the reference to pandemic or it doesn't include. We have, I have seen cases where force majeure was easy to claim, and there were some other cases where the pandemic did not amount to force majeure based on how the contract was written and how it would be interpreted under applicable law, which, kind of shocking to see that there is no harmonization on this issue across the contracts and different, laws. So it really fact specific. And I know that there is, and maybe you have the dates, Jeff, handy, but there is an investment arbitration seminar that's scheduled for November. And I think those
November 30th to December 4th, yes.
Yes, so I think that would be a good one to attend because they will cover a lot of those issues and will look into specific cases. So I think, litigation lawyers will have much more insights than, transactional lawyers on this point. But based on my experience, it has been all over the case.
I know another question came up, which again is a very good question, is has the economic decline and the decline for primary energy affected the productive capacity of oil and gas around the world? And the answer to that is not yet. Some projects have been delayed. Some projects have been shelved, and it's perhaps some projects may have even been canceled. So as more severe methods of dealing with the virus are practiced and energy demand continues to be reduced, ultimately there will be some reduction in the productive capacity of the oil and gas sector. And at some point in time, depending on how the economy rebounds, we could potentially get into a place where demand for energy skyrockets again, and there will not be sufficient productive capacity to meet that demand. That is a scenario. What the class decided today was that's probably not going to happen, that the recovery will either be slow, U-shaped, and there will be a lot of energy demand signals that will be sent to the industry so that more productive capacity could be built, or that it will be L-shaped, so we'll start from a lower demand to begin with and then rise at a typical economic growth rate, in which case, again, the industry will have time to recover and produce to increase their productive capacity. So I think 2 out of the 3 scenarios says that we're not going to be in trouble meeting future oil and gas demand. I will say that the most immediate problem is what do we do with all the productive capacity we have today? That's probably a bigger problem for the industry than worrying about how we're going to meet demand in the future at this particular point in time.
Any other questions out there?
I think we have a question from Nana, Charles. The question I was asking to know what happens to those countries who have never thought of natural gas as a means during the pandemic. Will it not be difficult for them to adapt or switch to this adequate form of protection through natural gas?
Yeah, I kind of hurried through that portion of the talk as we were starting to kind of run behind, but you're absolutely right. And this is probably a good advertisement for the natural gas seminar that we are hoping to conduct next year at the ILI. For the gas industry to work inside of a country, especially a consuming country for energy consumption, you need to have a lot of things in place to take advantage of a situation like today where there is surplus natural gas supply and lower prices. You need to have a very broad infrastructure, which we refer to as the natural gas value chain, that that establishes infrastructure for production or importation, transportation, processing, regasification if that's required, and then consumption. So you need to have a lot of processing, you need to have a lot of pipelines, and to do that, you need to have a very strong and predictable governance and regulatory system. You need to have a strong commercial framework so that all the participants in that value chain have a high degree of confidence that they will be able to operate unencumbered and successfully and generate a profit. And so, again, we have a whole course designed to talk about how you structure and use a system like that so that you can employ natural gas as a primary energy feedstock. And so again, if you're living in a country where some or all of that is already in place, this is the time to really think about increasing your use of gas. If you're in a country where that isn't in place, but you think that you can get all of those mechanisms and structure together, it's a really good time to plan, at least on the steps necessary to get that done.
Yes,
I have
Mr.
a-
Gosford, you can ask the question. Yeah.
I have a comment rather than a question. It is that our focus in terms of production seems to be more on the US. And what I would say is that the means of production in the US, which might be underutilized in the immediate future, are probably shifting south to Guyana and soon Suriname, because a lot of companies are moving resources into offshore Guyana, where they found a lot of oil. So that is where some of the activity is going on. Perhaps some of the thinking that you suggest might be advisable to adopt by the Guyana government. But I would also add that natural gas is not in abundance in that part of the world, apart from as a spin-off from the oil production. That is proposed to be brought ashore very soon, which is actually utilizing your advice that, if possible, countries should try to get more use of natural gas. I think it all depends on where you are in the world and what's going on.
Well, I agree with you 100%, and I thank you very much for your comment. It's very hard to generalize, but I tried to do that today with a more global look and approach to the situation. But you're absolutely right. All of these issues have a local aspect to them, and some global strategies may be advisable, but probably not. That each country has to decide for itself how it's going to react, how it's going to prepare, and how it will respond. You know, in the case of many African countries, there are projects that are underway. Dollars have already been spent, infrastructure has already been built. It's difficult for companies and countries that have sponsored these massive development projects to suddenly stop because global energy demand has wilted. And again, the China example is a good example. Their demand for energy went down, but the production of energy inside of China did not. They looked at their traditional import response and reduced whatever ability they had to reduce imports to protect their own internal economy. And you would definitely see that in places where, again, countries have internal projects that are either under production or soon to be producing. You want to continue those efforts. So that's absolutely true. You know, the U.S. U.S. is a different case, and I don't really know that what the U.S. does affects the rest of the world that much. The U.S. is now pretty much self-sufficient in the production of oil and gas, and so it's neither a large contributor to the rest of the world's supply or a large demand center for the rest of the world's supply. It's becoming an island unto itself. So I don't see the U.S. response affecting global energy near as much as, say, China or India or even Europe for that matter.
There is another question, I think. How will the ongoing effort of energy transition impact of LNG demand, and what strategies can countries adopt to reduce their risk exposure in terms of the negative impact?
Okay, would you repeat that, please?
Yes. How will the ongoing effort of energy transition impact of energy demand? And what strategies can countries adopt to reduce their risk exposure in terms of the negative impact?
Did you say NOG demand?
No, LNG.
Oh,
liquid
LNG
natural
demand.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, so there, I guess it depends on whether you are a country or a company that is producing LNG and trying to generate income and project returns as an exporter of LNG, versus if you're a country where you're an LNG buyer and are using LNG to meet part of your primary energy demand. And well, the answer is it depends. If you are an exporter, there's also, unfortunately, there's two situations there. You are an exporter that already has facilities and are trying to earn a return based on your productive capacity that's already established. Or if you're a potential exporter where you have a project that's yet to be completed, and then trying to figure out what to do with that future production. The strategy for current producers tends to be what we've seen in the past. If there's a period of extremely low pricing, what producers tend to do is reduce capacity and schedule major maintenance projects that will be coming up either in that year or the year following. So basically, let's just take a moment, produce less product, and while the machines are not operating, take that time to build in again projects and plans to inspect and repair and replace parts of our facility. It's about the only thing you can do because you really can't store LNG. If you're a country where you are planning to produce, this is really hard because it appears that there is currently surplus LNG productive capacity and there's surplus LNG shipping. And so the timing of the start of your project, if it's near term, is just unfortunately in a very bad spot. And that happens a lot in one of the guitar trains started out at one of the lowest global pricing points in the history. And so it unfortunately just had very poor economics. It barely cash flowed when it first started up. And again, if you are in a country where you have some control over the start of your project, and you're just going to have to do the analysis and decide whether it makes more sense to slow down the completion of that project and look at what the financial implications would be of something like that. I mean, you can't really change the marketplace. It's going to be very difficult to, in a time period where primary energy demand is in decline, to try to steal more market. But again, it is possible. I mean, I think that would be certainly a strategy that I would at least consider, is look to places that are currently using other forms of energy and see if you might not be able to do something cooperatively to switch demand from whatever it is they're using to more LNG or to more natural gas. As a consuming nation, again, this is a great opportunity to think about, well, to first audit and make sure that you're getting the benefits associated with a lower fossil fuel and hydrocarbon market, and make sure that the price that you're actually paying for your commodity is properly reflected in the contract that you've signed, and perhaps offering to renegotiate the contract by extending the terms and maybe changing the pricing mechanism in your favor. The other strategy, if you're a consumer, is to make sure that you're limiting the amount of your contractual obligations and then taking advantage of the spot market as much as possible and maximizing the capacity of your infrastructure so that you're using as much natural gas as you possibly can versus other fuels that might be more costly. I can think of a couple of countries right now that are using basically jet fuel to run their electric power generation gas turbines. And the reason that they're doing that is that they're having trouble with their pipelines and their pipeline control systems. And they are spending billions of dollars more every year fueling their power generation facilities with distillate fuel because they can't find the money to upgrade their pipeline and their measurement systems and their control systems, which is a fraction of that cost. And one country that I'm thinking of spends $2 billion a year in liquid fuel costs, and to fix their pipelines would cost roughly $350 million. So it's 1/8 of the cost, excuse me, and it would have lasting benefit far beyond just 1 year of supply. So again, this is an opportunity to really sit down and think strategically, because it's not, it isn't one of these cases where, well, gee, it's all gonna return to normal in two weeks or 2 months. I think there's going to be some long-lasting change, and so this is an opportunity where you really can do some strategic thinking about how you want to shape your economy and your energy economy in the future. Okay, I think we've taken more than everybody's amount of time that we agreed to. So I'm going to stop the questions there. If you have other questions, you can always send them to Jeff. He can get a hold of me, and then we can maybe work our way backwards. Or you can hold your questions to next spring, sign up for the course, and we can talk about all this sort of stuff and more. So with that, I'm going to leave you with some other, again, this is just one last thought that I hope you take away from our discussion today, and do a little bit of thinking and a little bit of research around how this might affect you personally and your institution that you work for and the country that you live in. So how has COVID-19 affected energy consumption in your country? What industries have been affected? Which will respond first and last? Because that's important from an energy use standpoint. How has the cost of or revenue from energy, has that changed substantially in your area? What role does or might natural gas play in meeting your country's future energy strategy? And what might be done to accelerate natural gas development and use, whether those be studies or planning based on studies or projects that have been based on the studies and plannings. So again, I think this is a great opportunity to be thinking about a lot of natural gas type of questions and seeing if you can make natural gas work much better for you in the future. Jeff?
Well, thank you, Rob. And as you noted, if you do have more questions, I mean, follow up, you'll have my email. Please follow up with questions. Those that have been to the ILI before know we're a big family. We like to stay in touch. If this is your first ILI event, I'll say again, we're a big family. We like to stay in touch. You're now part of the larger ILI family. We do have the course coming up in May. Hopefully we're back in person. May is a beautiful time to visit Washington, D.C. If not, we'll be online, and I'll say May is a beautiful time to be online and learn. We've got a good module and a good seminar we'll have for you either way. But you can always find more information on our website about the course. We've got that there as well. But again, I mean, follow up, ask questions. You are now part of the larger ILI family. Let us know how we can help you. Stay in touch, please.
And please send us any suggestions or requests you have for the type of content that you would like to see in the courses. If there's any specific topics that you think is not reflected in our syllabus for next spring, or if you would like to hear more about other topics that we can cover even this year, perhaps, just please let us know. We could do a brief sessions. Just send us emails, be in touch with us so that we can adjust our course, based on the demand.
I'll say Guli and Rob are very good at bringing that into the course when often if someone has that question, many people do, and it's wide applicability and goes into the course. But even if not, there's a way to do a short discussion outside of the class while you're in Washington while the seminar is going on. So please do send those questions and thoughts and ideas.
Let me just add that at least preliminarily, we're still thinking about a 2-week event. The first week is largely around natural gas policy, and the second week is largely around legal and commercial matters associated with natural gas development and use. Both courses are designed, however, to be standalone, so there's a little bit of overlap on both sides. But again, there's an opportunity to do a deep dive in some of the issues that we raised today early next year. So we hope you consider that, and we hope that we see you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Thanks again. Thanks for everybody hanging on.
Thank you. Be well, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Jeff and Tim.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Guli.
Thank you.